just a grassroots organization dedicated to addressing criminal justice reform. And tonight we are continuing on with the Black Studies Center Black History Month events with the Miseducation of the Negro and Black Studies. And just because we're a little short on time, I will leave my part pretty short because we have a panel of some amazing speakers who can say a lot more about this topic than I can. But for those of you who haven't read or have briefly read, Carter Godwin Woodson published The Miseducation of the Negro in 1933. He is also the founder of Negro History Week, which then developed into Black History Month in general. So this is a timely conversation, not only because of Dr. Woodson's contributions to Black History Month and literature in all reforms, but I think this book and some of the issues that Dr. Woodson brings up in this book are extremely relevant to the grassroots organizing and sort of community uprisings we have seen firsthand this past summer in 2020. And so I think it's extremely important to take this book as a historical pinnacle for addressing the educational and economic lack of mobility that Black people have been victim to. But I think it also has a very fitting place in a contemporary conversation because these uprisings and sort of the mainstream narrative around BLM and marches and protests that you see revolving around police brutality or criminal justice reform, all of those go hand in hand with lack of educational and economic mobility. And so the ways in which Dr. Woodson addresses these, we're still facing very similar problems, and if not the same issues, just in a more covert sense today. And we see that from community organizing and the fights that we're all still addressing today. So that will be my part. I would like to introduce our moderator for tonight, Dr. Fredrick Douglas Dixon. He is the executive director of the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Center, and also just a personal great mentor and advisor for me. And so without further ado, I will hand it over.
All right. Thank you, Timberly. And so that everyone knows, Timberly is a huge part of what we do at the Black Studies Center. And we have recently received word that she probably won't be around long because she has been accepted in the Texas A&M PhD program. So the way we feel about Timberly is she's a model for what we think about Black studies, particularly in rural areas. And she's earned that distinction. That means that from here on out, we'll be working really hard, double time, to make sure that we can, and she's ready, she's prepared, but we want to make sure that we can continue our mission. And that's she and I to move our center forward as a specialization in the West, if you will, but more specifically in Wyoming. And if you know anything about Wyoming, very monolithic. So we continue to struggle, and we do it with a sense of urgency. And now that clock has been turned up. So we're ready to go. So we do thank you, Timberly, for all your work, and nothing but the best will come from it. All right. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to get right into it. We're a tad bit late. We have an amazing panel here, really good friends, but more so scholars, practitioners, and freedom fighters. And I think that's probably in the other order, freedom fighters first. So Brother Rashid Faisal, this is a young man who is very adept in education and how education in itself becomes part of what we know as the mainstream narrative. So we're very impressed, and we're glad that you're here. So we want to keep moving. So we got Brother Rashid, he's out of Columbia University. And next is Dr. Michael Torrence, who is the president at Motlow State College in Tennessee. And we will find great value in what he will add tonight. But again, a freedom fighter and a very close friend, Dr. Will Guzman, out of Texas A&M Prairie View. And I thank him very much for being here. So let's understand that we've lost our time to break our arm, patting ourselves on the back. So it's time for us to get to it. So when you guys hear that term, and we were just having that conversation in class about the importance and the symbolic importance of a title and you think about the miseducation of the Negro. And we had a conversation here about what would you expect to read in that volume, particularly if you've never read it. So Brother Rashid, if you would start off with that thought, I think that'll put us in a really good space.
Well, thank you, brother, fellow freedom fighter Dixon.
Yes, sir.
I think when you think about miseducation of the Negro, one thing that you want to wrap your head around would be Carter G. Woodson's thought that the Negro or Black people have never received an education in America. So when you think about Brother Woodson, and I refer to him in that way because his thinking continues to live and impact what's happening within schools today. So when you think about Carter G. Woodson's work, you got to think of it, I call it a three-pronged approach. You can look at him as an institution builder, which he was. Absolutely. You can look at him as the father of Black History Month, which he is. But more importantly, from my lens, I look at him as an educational theorist and a practitioner. And as he goes through his 18 chapters, really giving a careful, a laser-like diagnosis of what is negatively taking place with the development of Black children who eventually become adults, you begin to see a narrative that supports his theory that technically speaking, Black people have never received an education in America, and thus we call it miseducation.
You're muted, sir.
Dr. Dixon.
You're muted.
Muted.
Dr. Torrence, I think we want to take a step from what Brother Rashid said, and let's place it in time and space. It's written
Absolutely.
in 1933, and the importance of this thought being written in between the two world wars on top of the title. So feel free, brother, please.
Sure. So, when we look back to 1933 up till now, you can see a divergence or convergence, rather, of rhetoric. And I place this sense of being in terms of time and space in Carter G. Woodson's work about the Black existence in terms of being inside of the economy, inside of a name is more than just a name. So the descriptor in terms of how someone places or understands their construct in society within how they are defined. Okay, so I'll say that again, the descriptor in terms of how someone understands who they are in society as they are defined. So when we talk about the crisis of the miseducation of the Negro, it begins not only with the economic being unstable, but it is also versed in rhetoric, and then the depictions that are affiliated with the timeliness between 33 and 2021, which is a long span, okay? And I know that I'm going beyond what Dr. Dixon asked, but in thinking about this span that is affixed to post-Harlem Renaissance, and then tied to the emergence of jazz and improvisation. And you have to stay with me as I explain this in the terms of art, okay? Jazz and improvisation to the movement of disco, right? Trying to move away from the ideology of, we move away from the hymnal and the spiritual to let's dance, let's forget, let's displace ourselves away from the conversation and the reality on Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, and then get up again and head to our synagogues, our mosques, and our churches on Sunday to be cleansed again, right? So then we fast forward again with hip hop culture, rhythm and blues. And now there is no intersection other than they're all linear. So this is not a circuitous conversation, it's parallel as we talk about how art is looked at when I refer back to economic as crisis and the rhetoric that defined the Negro from the span of 1933 through 2021, because the rhetoric is still consistent with the explanation of who you are and who you understand yourself to be while we're still becoming. And I'm not attempting to be poetic at all. This is just a language and a rhetoric that I understand to help us elevate beyond today's digital economy. And that is an important aspect of the work that Woodson talks about, because if we have no education, as a brother who spoke before indicates, right, then when we don't understand the language, therefore we cannot understand the culture, therefore we cannot place ourselves inside of the economy to purchase land, to understand the economic power that is affixed to what you own and how you speak. Therefore, that's how we defined ourselves partially in the United States of America.
Absolutely. And to add on to that, Dr. Guzman, Brother Will, thinking about social movements that allow for 1933 to be this centerpiece of what Dr. Carter G. Woodson lays in front of us. But one thing I have to go and take a step back for all of us, there is a volume that Dr. Carter G. Woodson puts forth that's called The Education of the Negro, which is indeed one of the best volumes that I believe that he writes that leads up to the miseducation of the Negro. So, Will, when we think about time and space, we think about social movements, we think about 1933, and we think about this particular volume. Feel free, Will. Will is frozen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. When you look at Brother Carter G, I think it's important for the audience to remember that he came out of the coal mines of West Virginia. This brother worked, 15, 18-hour days. Not only, being the oldest of 9 in his own family, he had to help support that family. But even afterwards, when he would begin his educational journey, that work ethic would continue well into, obviously, all of his life until his death in 1950. And so when he eventually does go to school at 18 years old, he is quickly absorbing that information. He's finishing high school in less than 2 years. And ironically, he would graduate from Douglas High School right there in Huntington, Virginia, in West Virginia. And so I think that's important to kind of lay out that foundation. He's the first generation after the institution of slavery. His parents were enslaved African captives right here in the hills of North America. And so that generation is a unique generation in terms of them wanting to embrace education and seeing it as a springboard or a platform to advance the race. And so when we look at 1933 classic, of course, The Miseducation of the Negro, and you just mentioned the Negro in Education book, which I
Seems as Dr. Guzman has been frozen.
am I still frozen?
Go ahead, repeat it, brother, just a little bit.
Sure. Well, I don't know where we got left off at, but nevertheless.
I think that we're going to experience this as we go along. So we will play very fluid with Dr. Guzman. And
how about now?
Even better now. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and mute this. Let's see if this version's any better.
You come up as
as I was saying, the classic, the Miseducation of the Negro is still relevant, I think, because when you look at the Black Power movement and the rise of Black studies, many of our folks are latching onto this classic because of what it says. And then there's a couple core things in there real quickly. Number one, this principle and idea to embrace a more radical political tradition is in there. And then number two, at the same time, ironically, is this conservative element. And that conservative element, of course, is how do we look at education and use that in order to advance the race? And that has a lot of overtures or a lot of overlayers, if you will, of that Booker T. Washington philosophy of education. So that was the beauty of Carter G, I think. And this is why you would see so many Black studies programs and students embrace this text. I'll go ahead and end there, but please come back to me when everyone else speaks.
I agree. I agree. But the first thing I think, and I would like to go straight to Dr. Torrence. The first thing I think of a scathing critique. Much needed, but a scathing critique nonetheless. When we talk about the miseducation of the Negro, from the title to, let's say, chapter 1, after the introduction, where he explains clearly that just the imparting of knowledge is not education. But literally, chapter 1, and many of you, particularly you guys on this screen, have written and published. The one thing we understand is that chapter 1 sets the stage. It allows for your reader to absorb your theoretical perspective and begin to give their own critique. Well, if I get it right, in chapter 1, which he names the seat of trouble, that is very important to be able to dissect. But he says the educated Negro has an attitude of contempt. This is how this volume starts. So it's not only a scathing critique of those who educate from without, because he has a chapter that deals directly with that, but he also places his burden, if you will, in a very clear and direct manner on the most formally educated of the Black population, which Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois would call the what? Talented 10th. So your thought about how he starts chapter 1, paragraph 1 and sentence 1, and the importance of that, Dr. Torrence.
So, I'm glad you tied it in with WEB because that was an ongoing dialogue between the Black hierarchy, not just in the academia, but also in society. So this concept of, I want to go to something that I think is deeper than anything else, and that is self-love and self-hate.
Yes,
as it references that first line in that first chapter. The idea or the ideology associated with Black success, not just then, but also now, is tied to this idea of being separate and being within, being above, being below, but being with. And that's a I can't use any other term other than when we try to parallel the many layers of being dynamic and understanding what it is to be African American or the Negro, as was written back then in America, and being educated. How do you fit within a system that is misaligned with your value system, which is misaligned with the understanding of how it is to work within a space that is not built for you to work within? So the rhetoric of code shifting is tied to this. The rhetoric of making sure that someone said to me today as I was leaving the office, don't put that hood on. Don't put that hood on, because the way in which we look, the way in which we speak, the way in which we act, the way in which we dress is a direct reflection on whether or not we will be accepted, not within our own communities, but in the communities in which we're trying to acquiesce into and be successful within. So I'll leave it there and open it up to my brothers to jump in.
Brother Rashid, when we think about how he begins this with a scathing critique of the formerly educated, what importance does that have? Not relevance, but what importance does that have to the rest of the volume?
Well, he sets the stage. And I'll just put it in plain terms that I typically share with students, that the slave mindset of the miseducated Negro is a result of the slave psychology that is taught within the educational system. So when you think about education, that debate, as Brother Torrence mentioned, between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, classical education versus industrial education, Carter G. Woodson puts it plain. Neither one of those systems would have solved the problems of Black folks, because within classical education, you were basically educating a formerly enslaved person to leave, whether it be Harvard or Yale or even our traditional Black colleges, they would leave to lead a life as a white man, which means they would have an education of a white person without white privilege. If you gave them industrial education, they were basically being taught skilled trades that were obsolete. They were not a part of the apprentice system. So basically you would have a person spending all their time being educated on skills that were obsolete and that were not applicable to the market. So he basically summed it up very, very succinctly. Black people were never meant to receive an education. So therefore, the different systems that evolved served one purpose: to ensure that Black people stayed in their place at the bottom of the socioeconomic order, politically disenfranchised, and as Brother Torrence mentioned, under the shadow of rhetoric, which Marcus Garvey and Carter G. Woodson called propaganda. So you had this image that was being put out there within the advertisement industry, textbooks, etc., that Black people, African descended people were uncivilized, savage, and basically intellectually inferior. So it really didn't matter which system Blacks went into, whether they went classical or industrial. It had the same outcome: dependency. Black people would be a dependent population, dependent on the economic system that was in place, dependent on what white society would give them. And typically it was nothing. So when you think about it within contemporary, when they say society, let's make America great again, it speaks to that mindset of let's ensure that Black people stay dependent. So it doesn't matter what type of education they receive, the goal is dependency. So in that first chapter, Woodson sets the stage as the seed of the problem is not Black people per se. We went after whatever education we can get. The problem was the slave psychology that was embedded in all systems of education as it related to Black people. So if you went to Hampton, the preparation was for you to be at the lowest end of the skilled trades. If you went to Harvard, you can get a PhD as the talented 10th was getting at Harvard, Columbia, but you were not taught to use that education to uplift your own people. You were taught in hopes of getting access to their institutions, which you were not going to get. So he really sets the stage in that first chapter to say, Black people, and I go back to my original statement, never received an education in America.
Well put. Before we go to Brother Will, we want to make sure that you are using the chat box to please forward your thoughts, your questions, and let us know, because we have a few questions already, and we thank you for those. We're going to get to those, but please feel free to use the chat as a way to enhance this conversation. Now, Will, we talked about that first chapter, the seed of trouble, and the first sentence talking about Blacks formerly educated Blacks having a attitude of contempt. In your mind, what is the power behind using that as an opening statement?
Sure. I'm glad the issue of psychology and education has been mentioned thus far, because when you look at this classic, psychology is really at the core. And here again, as I mentioned previously, this is one of the reasons why it has remained such an important book within Black studies. For example, you look at Robert L. Williams, The History of the Association of Black Psychologists. He profiles nearly 50 Black psychologists in that book, and almost every single one mentions this book, Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro. And so I know you being from Chicago, Dr. Dixon, you could appreciate brothers like Bobby E. Wright, Kobe Kanban, who, studied in the city, and so many others. And they use this as a seminal text within that field, psychology, even though obviously Carter G was trained as a historian, which, by the way, he's the first Black PhD historian who came from the descendants of African captives, right? Du Bois was, coming from the North. His parents weren't enslaved, but Carter G parents were. And so I think that's an important distinction to make. But also, in looking at that first chapter, Woodson Woodson, he really does not stop at criticizing anyone. It's like a no holds bar. No one's off limits, including the Black working class or the quote unquote masses. Although the bulk of the book is criticizing the Black bourgeoisie or the petite bourgeoisie, he does have some criticisms there for the Black working class, specifically as it relates to religion. You know, he very specifically mentions that this is the religion of the enslaver, was his word. I would call it the religion of the oppressors. And so he would catch a lot of flack from the religious class or the priestly class, including preachers and things of the sort. But you know, he lays into more specifically the middle class, and it's that group. And this is why also the book is so important, because it's really the first book that looks at critically this class divide within our race. And you would not see another analysis until years later with the 1957 publication of, you know, The Black Bourgeoisie by E. Franklin Frazier. And then 10 years later, 1967, Harold Cruz's classic, you know, I forget the name of the book now, but Cruz wrote a very important book, the Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, excuse me. And so for Woodson, looking at this class dimension, both the talented 10th, but also looking at this Booker T. Washington philosophy of education, and what he comes to and concludes is that we're not being educated, that we're being trained, and that too many of us want those degrees, want those titles, so we can have the trappings of middle-class income and life in order to remove ourselves from the masses.
Excellent, Will. I agree. I think that what you said is very much so tied into his thought, which we begin to see if we take a step back at Dr. Carter G when he says Negro History Week, and how that started in 1924 with a group of Omegas, and how that moves forward to him putting his foot down to tie it to literacy. And then it moves along to wanting to read and write about the accurate accomplishments of Blacks in America. But I think it's very interesting that you say it, Will. It's absolutely correct. He gives a critique of everyone. In many ways, the only thing that doesn't tie to the miseducation of the Negro that I think is very close to the letter from a Birmingham jail is the missing of the critique of white liberals. But what he is saying about this is that the church plays a role in this miseducation. What he says is there are enough things to go around. So as we move forward, he talks about how we missed the mark, and him laying this down right now, today, about how we missed the mark in formal education. And let's include those avenues and opportunities where we have educated ourselves. Right? We've seen many different vantage points and many different programs by many brilliant people, particularly, let's say, Marcus Garvey and the most honorable Elijah Muhammad. So when I think about the do for self, what I've been taught my entire career from formal education is how to look for a job and never how to make a job for myself. So President Torrence, when we talk about how we missed the mark with education, and if you tie that to your efforts right now today, how does Dr. Carter G. Woodson become very impressive or important in that thought?
It's important because, you know, and you have to look at it based on our own respective disciplines, right? So since mine is about literacy, mine is about English, mine is about language, mine is about words, mine is about how we define ourselves. And then I'll just get right to the chase. The idea that if we are going to aspire and achieve, then the expectation of what we do with that achievement in terms of not a hand up, not a handout, but a hand up. And in the expectation that the development of our communities, right? And I'll use that word community, the development of our communities is the responsibility of us all. It is not just on the back of those who achieve a certain quote unquote status that's recognizable in the community, from the janitor to the office of the president, from the shaman all the way up to the deacon. It is everybody's responsibility to lift up, literally, right? To lift up their communities. The reason that this is important today, and that I would say that this is an important work today, is that everything seems cyclical, does it not? the words, whether it's chapter 1, chapter 15, chapter 12, chapter 7, it is all tied to what's happening right now. And that is the societal unrest. It's really based off of a clear lack of holistic and broad understanding of how to operate and be successful in a space that is either ill-defined for you, or you don't really understand consciously the bias within the sets of rules in which you must play within. So I think that that's a conversation that maybe for another date, Brother Dixon, but it is tied to the importance of this work. And as communities endure, okay, as communities endure, whether they will placate and be accepting of what is already written and expected. The second part of the question is what we're doing here. My expectation begins with excellence for every single one of the people that comes across our threshold. So those who are in poor rural America, where Wi-Fi is not connected, where there's dark fiber laid, but not switched on because it is quote unquote unnecessarily an afterthought. So when the understanding about access, the understanding about equity, the understanding about inclusion goes beyond the conversation of diversity, right? Think about that for a second. It goes beyond the conversation of diversity. The economic, whether it's rural or micro metro struggle, is about the accessibility that is relayed through a cultural understanding or cultural impetus to allow those folks that achieve to be successful. And this is where I'm just cutting to the chase. I said allow those who have achieved to be successful. When you do not have the opportunity to build a strong sense of self within the spaces that you're given, you should simply move on and build your own space. And that's what I think the miseducation and the education of the Negro teaches us and espouses us to do. How long shall you wait for someone to come save you? There's no such thing as Superman. There's no such thing as Wonder Woman. If you want to see success, begin with you and have that expectation that your communities do the same.
Thank you. Thank you, President Torrence. So, Brother Rashid, when you think about how we missed the mark in contemporary connections, one thing I get from you is this ability to connect with Dr. Carter G. Woodson talked about and use it as his scion, if you will, and place it in time and space. And so what do you think about contemporary connections to how we missed the mark?
Well, I think it goes back to what Brother Torrence mentioned. When you are in a space that do not value your presence, do not value your contributions, when you are facing barriers to access, as Dr. Woodson would say, do you spend all of your time in protest, or do you begin to leverage your own cultural capital within your community to do for self? We mentioned a lot about the connection between Dr. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, but I think we have to include Marcus Garvey in this conversation because as you begin to read the entire volume of Woodson's work, as my other brother mentioned, it's a balance between a radical tradition and a conservative tradition. And right there in the middle, you have Garvey, who articulated this idea of Black people not waiting, as Brother Torrence stated, for some savior to come. But what can you do within your own culture to leverage the capital within your own community to build businesses, to develop schools, to make the church more responsive to the living conditions of the people, as opposed to this transition that Woodson spoke to of an emphasis on when we leave the earth. In other words, I want to prepare you for death as opposed to preparing you for living. So when I think about how we missed the mark, or where are we at right now, how does it translate to today's students? We are facing many economic crises, especially within the Black community in terms of access. So the question becomes, if we are increasing the graduation rate, are we just proud of that? Or are we going to reflect on what are we doing with this access to education? Meaning, are we developing businesses? Are we opening schools? Those who are getting degrees in theology, are we developing a theology that speaks to the legitimate needs and aspirations of a people? Or are we using our education to escape the very people we should be serving? And that goes back to that comment of despising your own people, leaving your own people. Here's one of the things that we always hear: get a good education so you can escape. Escape who? Meaning I have to get an education to escape my grandmother, my mother, my father, the guy down the block who supported me in my athletics. I have to escape all of this cultural capital within my community because I'm taught through my educational system to despise the very people that I see every day. As an educator, what I tell my students is get a good education so you can go back and make the community better that you came from. And you're seeing that today where many young people are finding space within their own community to transform the abandoned buildings, to transform the culture, to create opportunities to employ your own. So it's a shift in this paradigm from getting an education to escape to one of getting an education so that you can begin to build and empower your own space. Because as Woodson put it very plainly, you cannot escape yourself. You will take you with you wherever you go. And we have to begin to value the space that we currently occupy. That's the contemporary application of Woodson's work. Value the space you occupy and leverage your cultural capital, your human capital, to do for self within your communities. And that speaks to Marcus Garvey, and it also kind of speaks to what Elijah Muhammad was teaching through the Nation of Islam as well. And it also mirrors the Black entrepreneur movement within Booker T. Washington, because you have to remember all of these men were building on a Black intellectual legacy that was set the day that we came to this country and were marginalized. We have always thought of how do we create space to have independence within a system that rejects us.
Excellent. And I go back to what you said, Brother Rashid. You talked about escaping. So you escaped from the neighbor who helped you and supported you. You escaped from your grandmother who raised you, but you escaped to what? And you aspire to what when you escape? So I think Dr. Carter G. Woodson lays it out in that regard. Dr. Guzman, if you could continue that thought.
Of course, when you look at Carter G's classic, what he lays down specifically is a social commitment, social responsibility to the merchant class. And so if we are to engage in recycling those monies in our community, if we are to support Black-owned businesses, then those owners of those businesses have to have that political consciousness, that racial consciousness, that social justice element. If they don't have that, then obviously they're going to lose the support of the community. And so that, I think, is applied to the other groups that that Dr. Woodson is mentioning here, right? Including, of course, the preachers, the educators, and he even mentions doctors and lawyers and dentists and things of the sort. And so that, I think, becomes important. And this is why it's so relevant to this very moment. As we begin to look at, as many people say, Black faces in high places, as we look at, President Barack Obama, as we look at now Vice President Harris, I think we have to begin to question what benefits, tangible benefits, are we really getting, right? And so for Woodson, if he were around today, he would speak very directly to that in the terms of being extremely critical of these very influential individuals within our community, but yet have not done any systemic changes to impact the masses, right? True enough, they have, access to millions of dollars, and they have access to, influential people and things of the sort on an individual level. But on a group level, we have to begin to question and say, well, this is a new day. And that new day demands that we hold our leaders more accountable. And this is, I think, where Carter G. Woodson's text is so relevant to so many of us to this very moment. But for the working class, you know, who are trying to climb, right, lifting as we climb, if you will, his text has been so popular because it embraces this work ethic of doing for self, right? You mentioned Elijah Muhammad earlier, and so many others within the nation, including, of course, the Honorable Farrakhan and others, Brother Malcolm, Omawali. You know, what they all have in common is this idea of how do we get the government out of our lives? How do we reject the oppressor's assistance in trying to meddle in our lives? And how do we begin to do for self? Now, on its surface, including Garvey, on its surface, that's a very appealing message. However, I would be somewhat a little bit critical and maybe push back just a little bit, because I refuse to let the oppressor off the hook. In other words, I'm not going to erase the fact that they kidnapped me as an act of war and brought me to foreign and distant lands in chains, right? So at the same time that I'm rejecting the government assistance, I'm also going to hold the government accountable for allowing those conditions to persist within my community. And so that's the balancing act that Woodson speaks to in his classic. The last thing I want to just mention real quickly is the contradictions, right? We're all full of contradictions, including myself and others. And the two people I mentioned, Vice President Harris and former President Barack Obama. And Woodson is no different, right? And here are the contradictions. While he's criticizing the working class, particularly for embracing the, enslavers' religion, that's his words, not mine. He himself, is perpetuating this idea of the talented 10th, which is a very elitist notion that only the leaders within our community can save us, right? There's enough room at the table for both the working class and the leadership class to come together to save ourselves.
I appreciate the critique that you give of him having this battle within himself and him erring on the side of allowing for us to sit here and give a critique of that. We got a couple of questions, you all. I want to ask.
Brother Dixon.
Okay, go ahead.
I can't help myself. I just got ignited. That idea of from where you are within your community, and I can't impart upon those who are listening and us enough about the community, right? The best of us and the worst of us, and then in the middle. So this concept of you can only lead if you are a preacher. You can only lead if you are a CEO. You can only lead if you're a business owner. That is just bunk. You can lead if you are the person who is sitting on the park bench and young men and women are coming across your path and you have a kind word or a lesson of wisdom because you've lived through this life. You've experienced success and failure. That is also a part of the education or the miseducation, depending on how we want to couch it, that takes place within all of our communities. So it is not, for the listeners, it is not just the scholar who leads or the president that leads. No matter where you sit within a community, you have an opportunity and the duty and obligation to lead. So I couldn't move away from that without sharing that tidbit. Thank you, Will, for sparking that.
Brother Dixon, can I just make one comment to that? I appreciate the comment in terms of that leadership piece, because what Woodson mentioned, he said, how do we get to the ghetto? How do we become economically disenfranchised and poor? He said, you got there from your leaders. Your leaders led you there. So he said, we don't need more leaders, we need more servants. And that's what Brother Torrence is speaking to. We need grassroots movement from the people who are closest to the problem. And we need to educate more within the community to take on that role of servicing their communities as opposed to waiting for that elected official, whether it be President Obama, whether it be Vice President Harris or anyone else that they're supposed to pass legislation that uplift our community. So in his writings, he's very clear. We don't need more leaders because you got to your current state because of your leaders. What you need is more servants, people who are here to service the community where they stand, meaning right there in your neighborhood, close to your university, your schools, where local politics are taking place. Let's have the local people get involved with the issues that impact their way of life, as opposed to waiting for some leader to come along and wave the magic wand and all of your problems go away.
Yes,
Not
sir.
going to happen.
Give of yourself so you can receive from others, you know?
Exactly.
Absolutely. I wanted to go through a few questions because we have quite a few. Obviously, we won't be able to get to them all. But one question is, do you believe that the lack of proper education is just as harmful to white youth as it is to Black youth? First part. Second part, does the lack of diverse education help keep the institutions of racism and bigotry alive in the states? Feel free.
Well, I'll just quickly say affirmative to both of those. In other words, yes, many of the white youth in this country today are being misled by their institutions and miseducated. Despite what Pew Studies and other think tanks say that white young are more progressive than ever before, that has not been my experience. I've been teaching now for over 20 years, and there are many young white people, obviously not all and not even most, but there are many that do still have vestiges of racism, particularly as it relates to us, to Black folks. And you see this over and over again. Let's, for example, in the healthcare industry, there are many young whites in the healthcare industry, including white doctors and white nurses, but yet there are many medical professionals who still believe that we do not have the capacity to experience pain at the same level. And that's been proven, in numerous studies. This is not just anecdotal. And so I think that becomes important, that where are they getting that mindset from? Where are they getting that education from? And it's obviously their institutions that are misinforming them or not even mentioning us at all. The second half of the question, as it relates to what was the second half of the question? I forgot now. I think you mentioned
does the lack of diverse education help keep
thank you. That diversity, that's right. Diversity becomes important because it too often we couch it in terms of a multicultural education, but as Brother Malana Karinga says, too often multicultural education is just food, fashion, and festivals, and as a result, they just help perpetuate stereotypes within our community. And so, yes, I think that the lack of true diverse education requires power sharing, and there's not enough power sharing going on at these institutions.
Feel free.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Just one comment on the diversity piece. As my good brother just mentioned, that if we turn diversity into a celebration of food and clothing, we're missing the mark. And I think when Brother Woodson crafted Black History Month or Negro History Week, it was also for the purpose of correcting the narrative. Because when you think about African history, the history of African descended people, Black American history, it is pregnant with stereotypes, omissions, false narratives. So oftentimes these false narratives reinforce what children see in the media, okay? Because most of us get our racial education at home and in our communities from television and from what we see, okay? So so for instance, if you have a young white person or non-Black person, they have already developed a definition of who they think Black people are from these informal systems of education. So what we need is diversity that is embedded in a more accurate narrative of who we are from a social, political, and historical perspective. But unfortunately, we can't get to that place because we have to deal with the elephant in the room, which is racism and white supremacy. So schools are reluctant to address those issues because they don't want to touch that elephant in the room. It's not comfortable. It's not a comfortable space. But here's the thing, if we're going to get to a level of genuine diversity, we've got to deal with the elephant in the room and really begin to teach an accurate history, which gets into this whole debate of the 1619 Project, even with some of its historical, I don't want to say inaccuracies, I would just say interpretations, along with this 1776 Project, some schools opting to have children opt out of Black History Month programming. All of this is that huge debate because we don't want to deal with white supremacy and racism, and we can't escape it. So for me, yes, diversity is a good thing. But if it's going to be of a surface level where we talk about food, dance, and clothing, then it's actually supporting the continuation of white supremacy and racism. So we have to deal with that elephant in the room.
I agree. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Agreed. You know, the dialogue needs to deepen so that, and I can't get away from it, so the community can strengthen. And this ideology that we're tied to isn't just simply about what people see and what they are comfortable talking about, but it moves to, as you've seen in various places across the U.S., getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. Well, to eat, to dance, to talk about styles of dress is one thing, but to understand the cultural appropriatisms that are associated with aligning yourselves with one culture. And I've mentioned some of those cultural appropriatisms, such as hip hop, such as disco, such as jazz and blues, et cetera, et cetera. And as we look at who's doing what and who's representing these very cultural appropriatisms, you see that there is no escaping each other, whether we like it or not. Okay, there is no escaping each other, and that escapism is that, you know, going backwards to go forward. If we aren't ready, if we refuse, because simply it's a refusal. If we think we need to create policy to have a dialogue, we're sorely misleading the youth who are coming behind us and preparing them simply to have a cyclical conversation that we have continued to have since the early 1900s and since Jim Crow and since post-colonialism, so on and so forth. And to get beyond that, you know, we have to take the shoes off and take the socks off, and we all got to walk on the same ground so that it is common ground, and really have that deep conversation that makes everyone feel uncomfortable. And it's not just uncomfortable for those who are, quote unquote, the elite or those who are the other. It is going to be uncomfortable for those who have to answer some questions. I don't think that we have the expectation that people feel responsible for things that they had nothing to do with. But I do think that we all feel duty bound about what we look like and how we work together going forward.
I wanted to, thank you, Dr. Torrence, but I wanted to go to the word diversity. And we know that's a hot button topic. I think diversity has very different functional definitions for Black and white organizations. So when I think about diversity in a setting of a higher education institution, that means that we're going to inject someone who has a certain physical characteristic, but in essence will be a ball carrier for the ruling regime. When we think about diversity in Black organizations, that means many times that Blacks are willing to give up their positions of authority to include their open enemy. So in many ways, when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it's become not just a catchphrase, but I think it is one of those things that upholds status quo. It's the continuum of the ruling regime's power. And in many ways, I think that term will come and go because there was a problem that brought about diversity in the very first place. And I believe that after the term wears itself out, there will still be those vestiges and those pillars that will remind us of authority and those who have lack of authority and the way that they, if you will, as the old folks would say, what they did not do when they were sitting on the pot. Now, a lot of that comes back to our learned behaviors. We have a really active argument here in this class about learned behaviors. So what I think that comes out of diversity is this laundry list of learned behaviors of where we should and shouldn't go as Black, particularly those of authority. So I agree with you. They are folks who have sat in very positions of authority, but a lot of times they're mannequins in the window of diversity. And they're also shadows and not images. So a lot of this is going back to what Dr. Carter G. Woodson said is the root of the problem when we think about chapter 1, when we think about the very first sentence, and he says, the educated Negro has an attitude of contempt. I think that's a learned behavior. And I think when you're forced to be able to move from those who you love just because of what you have so-called accomplished is another vehicle. It's just another avenue to reinforce or concretize those outcomes that have already been set. So we got another couple of questions, you all. So one of the questions reads, with the events of January 6th in mind, and understanding that education is a powerful agent of socialization, how can we change the system to be more inclusive and diverse? That's part 1. What do we need to do to make it easier to access the system for all?
I can't get away from language, and you know, it's really difficult to get away from what you are and how you walk through the world in the first place, right? So, in terms of what transpired on the 6th, obviously it was abhorrent to think that even our predisposed ideals around an ideology around what it means to be a democratic nation, but to see that was attacked in that fashion as we're going through what was our due process, right? What we agree is the law of the land is the appropriate way to go. So the challenge within that is within the language. And I'll go again backwards to go forward. When I am asked in the last year or so about diversity, I have asked the reporters, I've asked the people who I spend time with in the community, I've asked them, why do you keep asking me about diversity? And the reason I asked that question, I posed that question because I have been working within a diverse construct from day one. And I think it's more important to ask the question of those who are helping define the concepts or the predispositions of what diversity is versus asking me. And me speaking for me, not me speaking for anyone else who looks like me. So that's a trope that I want to make sure that's clear. I'm not speaking for everyone. I can only speak for me. But what I am happy to discuss, inclusion. I am happy to discuss inclusion as a state. And what that means is those who sit in those chambers and make decisions about policy and law, and who is in seats to make determinations about how we engage with each other across the US. Inclusive dialogue needs to be taking place. And it's not just about representation of sex, gender, and orientation, but if they're working for the people, is that apt? Are they really working for the people? Drain the swamp has been something that has been discussed. So what does that look like? I don't think that, and this is my own personal predilections, I don't think that there was, whether we like it or not, the founding forefathers of our country. And I'm not just talking about those who wore wigs in chambers, I'm talking about those who built this great nation, okay, on the backs of those who look like Black and brown people who built the nation, and Asian people that built the railroads. I'm talking about this idea that representation of the people was never meant to be a career. And I think that's part of the conversation as well in that dialogue about rhetoric. If we have a systemic group of men and women who cyclically and longitudinally represent their respective districts, states, counties, are we not going to get the same outcomes over and over again? Now, I don't know if I answered that question, but that was my attempt at it.
Yeah.
Feel free. Feel free, jump right in.
Well, I'll jump in with what occurred January 6th. It was shocking to white America, but it wasn't shocking to Black America. It was actually predictable. When you've had centuries of racial rhetoric, propaganda, race hate, these actions become very, very predictable. But the problem that we faced over the centuries is that we've ignored the elephant in the room. So when we talk about diversity, and I've had this in some conversations and educational workshops and forums, can we talk about diversity in absence of talking about white supremacy and racism? See, oftentimes we want a feel-good conversation about diversity, that we all go away and we feel good about our time together. But if we really talk about diversity, we are going to have to deal with some very serious issues that are systematic, and have created a lot of problems throughout history. So I was thinking about this whole thing of integration, and you think about the Brown decision. The question that I've always had was, why did the Black community have to bear the burden of integration? It was one-way buses. Buses were leaving our communities, going to other communities. Our schools were closed. Our principals were fired. Our teachers were let go. What did we give up through that process of embracing integration and diversity? That becomes a question that we have to ask. So for me, when I think about that term diversity, especially in light of what happened January 6th and the other part of the question of what can we do about it, I think that we have to make a decision that we're going to have the tough conversations that need to be had. And then we're going to marry those conversations to what Woodson mentioned, to social action. Because he said, we don't need any more resolutions. We don't need any more holidays, or we don't need Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, okay? Or coins with the Tuskegee Airmen. All of the things are great. What we need is systemic change, inclusion, and access. As Du Bois said, is it possible for me to be a Negro and an American without having the doors of opportunity closed to me and spit upon and treated in a dogged manner? We have yet to answer that question, because the problem of the 20th century in terms of the color line, that problem is still with us, despite all of the resolutions and all of the different workshops and all of the different things we've done over time to address the race issue. White supremacy and racism is the ill of this country, the dis-ease of this country. And until we're ready to really wrap our heads around that, our children will inherit this same conversation. It'll be just a different panel, different people, but we'll be discussing the same issue 100 years from now.
Thank you. So Will, if you could chime in on that, and then we're gonna have some closing remarks.
Sure, I'll just say real quickly, 5, 10, 20 years from now, many teachers in the public school system will describe that event in terms of politics and political ideology. I see that event, of course, through the lens of Black America, in terms of knowing that was not surprising to me, because I know the long history of violence by whites against us. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that all whites are violent, but that is to say that many whites have the capacity and have engaged in that violence. Second, what it says to me is that people's budget priorities speak volumes. And so last year, the US federal government spent over $744 billion in national defense spending in order to finance the over 800 US military bases around the world. And then when you include, of course, the internal police state that we are living under, what happened on January 6th, of course, was, expected. And so we could say here, or at least I could say jokingly, yeah, I just took out the popcorn and just, sat down and watched, right? And if I were to say I was gleeful, that would be inaccurate. Unfortunately, I was extremely saddened that the attitudes are so hardened on both sides, from the moderates to the conservatives. The moderates in the sense of they felt that the conservatives would not react violently, right? They assumed the best of that crowd. And then, of course, saddened because of the conservatives, which, of course, this long violent history. And so, unfortunately, I think we could expect that to continue for quite some time to come. And without power sharing, it will continue for decades, if not generations. And power sharing must include whites giving up their political and financial monopoly. And that could be done in a variety of ways. For example, for many young whites who are progressive and want to assist our cause, not only being on the front lines of marches and standing in between us and the violent police, but when they draft their wills, for example, they could will over their property to working class Blacks, including Black families. When they die, they could have life insurance policies that have very specific beneficiaries that are Black families, for example. When they have their stocks and bonds, they could will that over to HBCUs. So there's a variety of strategies and tactics that young whites could dismantle this racist capitalist system in order to disrupt it and transfer that wealth. And then finally, we must vote in politicians that will vote for the $21 trillion in reparations.
Absolutely. Thank you for the thought. And as we wrap this up, you all, I wanted to go over Dr. Carter G. Woodson's and this volume's importance for the future. So President Torrence, on the way out the door, if you could wrap it up with the validity and the importance of this piece in the future.
Well, I'll end by coming in. So knock, knock, let's say who's there, and it's me. So when you close your eyes and you think about walking through a space, who do you see? And I hope that when I ask that question and you close your eyes and you go knock, knock, and who do you see? Your ideologies are broadened and you move to the sense of being, the state of being. And I started with that and I'm gonna end with that. Okay, so this idea of being, right? The spaces in which we operate, the spaces in which we create for economic prosperity, for the dialogue that we've discussed tonight that needs to take place. It begins with everybody who's listening to this presentation this evening. See something, do something. Stop talking, act. Stop designing and creating for the sake of creating and designing, but implement and create social action. This is the work of Woodson. To do or do not. There is no try. We either must do it, or we will continue along this pantomime that we have continued on for hundreds of years. I would like to thank the two other esteemed colleagues on this call and presentation this evening. It's been peace and blessings to be with you this evening. Thank you, Dr. Dixon.
Brother Rashid.
There we go. I think I'm going to go with Woodson's statement that we have to move away from following the line of the least resistance. We're going to have to confront very clearly the ideology that has shaped our country. We're going to have to face the impact of racism and white supremacy and the role that has played in shaping the educational system, the political system, the economic system, the healthcare system. It is an all-encompassing dis-ease or disease that has impacted not just Blacks, but white Americans and all people who call themselves Americans and that are a part of this country. So unless we begin to honestly take that tough road of addressing those two issues of the ideology of white supremacy and the practice of racism, then we will find ourselves back at this conversation at this table again. The other thing that I would like to end with is that we have to begin to think about less leadership and more servants, meaning the work begins where your feet are at. So you have to get involved with your community. If you want to have diversity, we have to intentionally look for ways to be inclusive, meaning we can't wait for it to happen. We have to be very intentional about the things, the transfer of wealth, which is a real thing. And it's not new. When we came out of captivity, many well-meaning and well-intentioned whites supported the building of Black schools through the very process that was mentioning, through their wills, through taking monies from their investments so that they can participate in genuine, as they called it, the upliftment of the race. Woodson spoke to that he spoke that that before 1880, there was a more focused effort on Black and white coalitions that actually were beneficial to Black people. What we have today is window dressing. We have the Gap. If they have the Gap or some company that's willing to put out Black Lives Matter t-shirts, and if we put a t-shirt on, we feel as if we're doing something. No, we need concrete material and resource change within our community. If not, then we are actually, as Woodson stated, we are wasting our time.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Guzman?
I'll just end on a very famous Woodson quote, which suggests that we must reject the worldview of the oppressors. He states in his classic, The Miseducation of the Negro, 1933, quote, "When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or to go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary," unquote.
I thank you all. I couldn't ask for a better conversation about Dr. Carter G. Woodson. I think it's of upper importance that we leave Dr. Carter G. Woodson as an important piece for those who are behind us and those we'll never meet. But one thing I do believe that Dr. Carter G. Woodson answers in The Miseducation of the Negro in many ways is he speaks directly to the Negro question of the Mohawk Conference. When that question says, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Well, he gives the blueprint, he gives the critique, and he allows for his words to resonate. So I think about that in many ways. And again, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but I thank you all for being so active in the chat box. And I'm very thankful for our group of presenters. You guys know if there's anything I can ever do to repay this favor, I'm only one phone call away. So I thank you all so much. And President Torrence, I look forward to seeing you on the 23rd, dear brother.
Yes, sir.
I am up and ready for the challenge to come to Motlow State again. I enjoy that place. And thank you for all the works that you do. Brother Will, it's been some time, but I remember that time we had in Texas when we were at NCBS. And
Yes.
Brother Rashid, we are just getting started. So we'll be very close in what we do in the near future. So I thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Toby.
you all.
Thank you, Timberly. Thank you to all.
Thank you for the attendees. We appreciate you guys.
And yes, sir, to the attendees. All right, you all.